For 10 years, I kept a door locked inside my head. Never opened it. Never even stood too close to it. Because behind that door was a feeling I had no right to. Not while Ryan was alive, and certainly not after he was gone. I was his best friend. She was his wife. Some things you bury deeper than grief and call it loyalty. Then, one rainy Tuesday evening, his widow drove to my house, sat across from me, and opened a box full of letters written in his handwriting. And the first one had my name on it. If this story is already calling to you, stay with me. Where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. It means more than you know. Now let me take you back to the Tuesday evening when everything quietly changed. I shut off the engine, slipped my phone into my pocket, and walked toward the porch like I was heading back to an ordinary night. I had no idea that by the time I reached the front door, nothing about that house would feel ordinary anymore. By the time I turned onto Hawthorne Lane, the inside of my truck smelled like rain, engine heat, and the expensive floral perfume Nina had worn to dinner. She had hugged me beside the valet stand downtown, all silk sleeves and easy laughter, and some part of that evening had followed me home in the fabric of my jacket. My phone buzzed in the cup holder as I parked beneath the leaning maple tree in front of Clara Whitmore's house. I looked at the screen before I picked it up. Thank you again for tonight. I had a really lovely time. Nina's messages always sounded the same way she did in person. Polished, considerate, impossible to dislike. She was beautiful in a restrained kind of way, with pearl earrings and a voice that never rushed. On paper, she was exactly the sort of woman a 41-year-old divorced man was supposed to be excited about. I set the phone face down without answering. The date had been pleasant. The food was good, the conversation was easy, and Nina had listened when I talked about work instead of looking for an exit like some women did the moment they heard the words heating units and crawl spaces. Still, during dessert, I had caught myself wondering whether the porch light would still be on when I got home. That should have told me something. I didn't let it. The house sat at the end of the block with its white paint peeling at the trim, and its broad front porch sagging half an inch lower on the left side. I knew every weak board and stubborn hinge in that place. I had fixed most of them myself over the last 18 months. What I hadn't fixed was the feeling that the house had become more than an address somewhere along the way. Maybe because Clara lived downstairs? Maybe because she had a way of making ordinary things feel noticed. The porch light was on. So was the lamp in the front sitting room. Clara was in the wicker chair near the railing with her legs tucked to one side, and a gray cardigan pulled tight around her waist. A mug rested on the little iron table beside her, and there was a stack of envelopes under her hand held flat like she didn't want the wind to claim them. She lifted her face when she heard the truck door shut. For a second, she smiled. That smile had become one of the landmarks of my life. "Hey," I said as I came up the steps. "You're still awake." "I'm not usually asleep before 10, she said, though we both knew that wasn't true when she had an early morning at the shop. Up close, I could see the faint crease between her brows and the untouched tea gone dark in the mug. The envelopes on the table weren't junk mail, county tax notices. One of them had a red stamp on the corner. Her eyes flicked to my jacket, and then to the phone in my hand. "How did your date go?" she asked. "Fine," I said first, because that was the safe answer. Then, because Clara had always looked at me like she could hear the part of a sentence a man kept to himself, I added, "Better than fine, I guess. We had a good time." Something changed in her face so quickly, I might have missed it if I hadn't spent the last year noticing things I wasn't supposed to care about. The corners of her mouth held for a beat too long, as if they were waiting for permission to stay where they were. and then the smile thinned and slipped away. She lowered her gaze to the envelopes. "I'm glad," she said, and there wasn't anything wrong with the words themselves. It was the way she said them, carefully, like someone setting down a box marked fragile. "It's good that you met someone nice." I stood there with one hand in my jacket pocket and the other hooked around my keys, suddenly aware of the smell of Nina's perfume on my collar. It felt out of place there, almost rude. Clara slid the envelopes into a neat stack. "You should get some sleep," she said. "You have that early job in Beaverton tomorrow." I blinked. "You remembered that? You said it at breakfast yesterday." There was no accusation in her voice, no bitterness. If anything, that made it worse. I had no defense against Clara when she was gentle. She gathered the mail and started to stand. One envelope slipped loose and fell face down near my boot. I bent before she could stop me and saw enough through the thin return window to catch the amount due. It was more than most people paid for a used car. Clara. Her shoulders stiffened before she lifted her eyes to mine. "It's nothing I can't handle. It was a lie told with perfect posture." "Maybe not," I said. "But you look like you haven't slept in a week." A humorless breath left her. "And you look like a man who should be inside washing someone else's perfume off his jacket." The words landed harder than they should have. Not because they were cruel. Clara wasn't cruel. They landed hard because they were honest in a way I wasn't ready for. "Clara, don't." She shook her head once, almost annoyed at herself. "I asked a simple question. You answered it, that's all." But it wasn't all. We both heard the lie in that. The night air moved between us, bringing with it the smell of wet cedar from the side fence and the faint metallic scent that old houses gave off after dark. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked and then gave up. Clara looked tired enough to fold in on herself, but she stayed standing with one hand on the back of the chair, like the porch was the only place she could still keep her balance. "I should have gone through those papers earlier," she said, not looking at me. "I let too much pile up." I glanced at the red-stamped envelope again. "You don't have to do all of that alone." That finally made her look at me. "Yes, I do." She said it softly, but it carried the force of something practiced, something old. I knew bits and pieces of Clara's history the way you know the shape of a room from standing at the doorway. An ex-fiancé who'd left debts behind. Her mother dying 3 winters before I'd moved in. The antique store barely surviving one bad season after another. But I had never seen the full weight of any of it sitting this close. She drew in a breath, and for one strange second, I thought she might actually tell me what was wrong. Instead, she asked, "Did she make you laugh?" I frowned. "What? Your date?" She pressed her lips together. "Did she make you laugh the way you laughed tonight?" There was no right answer to that. I felt it instantly. I stared at her, and she seemed to realize too late that she had stepped over some line she had drawn for herself years before I ever moved into that upstairs room. A flush climbed into her cheeks. She looked away toward the street, toward nothing. "Forget I asked that." "Clara, I mean it." She set the stack of envelopes against her chest. "I'm tired, Ethan. It's late." She turned before I could decide whether to stop her. The screen door gave its usual protest as she opened it. Warm yellow light spilled across the porch boards and caught on the edge of her hair. She paused with one hand on the frame, not looking back. Then she said, almost under her breath, "Some women only know how to like a man when he's easy. That doesn't mean they'll know what to do with him when life stops being convenient." I didn't move. A beat later, she added, "Good night." The door shut softly behind her. I stayed where I was, listening to the lock click and the old house settle around me. In my pocket, my phone lit up again with Nina's name across the screen. I didn't pull it out. All I could see was Clara's face when I told her the date had gone well. And all I could think was that somewhere inside this house, a question had been asked that I still hadn't answered. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Clara on the porch holding those envelopes against her chest, like she could keep bad news from becoming real if she pressed hard enough. Around 2 a.m, I gave up on sleep, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked around the upstairs room I had been calling mine for a while. The slanted ceiling, the old radiator, the dresser I'd brought over in one trip after the divorce. None of it would have belonged to my life if I hadn't answered a handwritten card in the hardware store 2 summers earlier. Room for rent, quiet house, no smoking, stable tenant preferred, call after 6. I had copied the number onto the back of a receipt and almost thrown it away twice. At that point, I was living in a furnished apartment above a tire shop, eating takeout 3 nights a week, and pretending the silence after my son went back to his mother's place didn't bother me. I told myself I wanted cheaper rent and a shorter drive to work. The truth was simpler. I wanted a place that didn't feel like a waiting room for the rest of my life. Clara answered on the 3rd ring, gave me the address, and told me I could come by the next evening if I was on time. The house looked older up close than it had from the curb, broad-shouldered and tired, with ivy along one side and a porch that had seen too many winters. Clara opened the door before I could knock twice. She was wearing jeans, a cream sweater, and reading glasses. She removed the second she saw me, as if she preferred to meet strangers without anything in the way. She didn't flirt. She didn't perform warmth. She just stepped aside and said, "Come in," with the calm confidence of a woman who had learned that politeness worked better than charm. I remember thinking she looked like someone who kept every important part of herself in locked drawers. She showed me the kitchen first, then the narrow dining room, then the back staircase that led to the room I'd be renting. On the way up, she listed the rules in a voice, so even it took me a minute to realize they weren't really about housekeeping. No smoking anywhere on the property. No surprise guests after 10. Clean up after yourself in the kitchen. Lock the front door if you come in late. If either of us wants privacy, we respect it without questions. And if something breaks, tell me before it becomes expensive. She paused outside the bedroom and added one more without looking at me. I value peace in this house, Mr. Mercer. If you bring chaos with you, it won't work. I should have heard the bruise inside that sentence. Instead, I nodded and said, I'm too tired for chaos. The room itself was plain, but clean, with a dormer window facing the street, and enough space for a bed, a dresser, and the folding workbench I still hadn't unpacked. Clara stood near the doorway while I looked around, giving me room, but not distance. When I asked why she was renting it out, she said, "Old houses are expensive, and I prefer one dependable tenant to 3 careless ones." Then she named a rent low enough to make me suspicious, and added, "I don't bargain, and I don't chase people for money. I told her I paid on time." She held my gaze for a second, then said, "Good. So do I. I moved in that Saturday with a borrowed trailer, 2 mismatched lamps, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after a marriage ends, and everything solid has to be carried out by hand." Clara was in the front garden when I arrived, clipping dead leaves off a rose bush that had no business still blooming in June. I expected a nod and nothing more. Instead, she came up the driveway, took the lighter box from my arms before I could object, and asked where I wanted the coffee maker. By noon, she had set a roll of paper towels on the kitchen table for me, cleared shelf space in the pantry, and left a spare key by the fruit bowl with a note that read, "Front door sticks when it rains. Lift before you turn. That evening, I noticed the outlet near her microwave sparked when she plugged in the kettle. I fixed it before dinner. She acted unimpressed. But the next morning there was fresh coffee waiting. That was how it started. Not with a spark or a confession, but with practical things that would have looked like nothing to anybody standing outside the windows. She learned I left for jobs before sunrise on Mondays and began setting the timer on the porch light the night before. I learned the back gate dragged after heavy rain and shaved the swollen edge so she could close it without putting her shoulder into it. She discovered I forgot to eat when work got busy and started leaving half a sandwich wrapped in wax paper in the refrigerator. I discovered she talked to the house under her breath when a drawer jammed or a hinge stuck, as if the place were stubborn family rather than lumber and nails. Lying awake now, with the porch scene still fresh in my mind, I understood what I had missed. We had been building habits with the shape of attachment long before either of us called them that. By dawn, I still hadn't decided whether Clara's reaction the night before had come from jealousy, worry, or sheer exhaustion. Maybe all three. But I knew this much. The rules she gave me on move-in day had never only been rules. They were sandbags around a flooded heart, stacked neatly enough to pass for order. And somewhere between the spare key in the fruit bowl and the coffee she kept leaving on the counter, I had stopped being a man renting a room. I just hadn't admitted it yet. When I heard the first floorboards creak below me the next morning, I got out of bed knowing I wouldn't be able to look at Clara the same way again. The next morning I came downstairs later than usual, half expecting Clara to be in the kitchen and half hoping she wouldn't be. I wasn't ready to see whether her face had gone back to normal. The room was empty. A bowl covered with a plate sat near the stove to keep it warm, and beside it was a note in Clara's neat slanted handwriting. "Eat before you go. Long day today." That was all. No name. No apology for the porch. No mention of the date. Just 6 words that somehow reached me deeper than a conversation would have. I stood there with the note between my fingers, listening to the old refrigerator hum and the wall clock click forward 1 second at a time. She had left early for the shop, but she had still made breakfast before she went. I ate standing at the counter like I always did when I was running late. Scrambled eggs, toast, and the kind of practical care that could still be explained away if a man was determined enough to stay blind. I rinsed the plate, set the note in my wallet without thinking, and headed out to the truck. That should have been the end of it. Instead, all day long, my mind kept pulling old memories forward and setting them beside the one from the porch. There was the January ice storm during my first winter in the house, when I got home after midnight with my gloves soaked through and my shoulders aching from hauling equipment in freezing crawl spaces. I'd opened the front door quietly, trying not to wake her, and found a pot of soup on the stove with a dish towel over it and a sticky note on the handle. "Don't argue. Heat it first." I had laughed out loud in the empty kitchen. Then I ate 2 bowls by myself, while snow tapped at the windows, and the whole house creaked like an old ship. The next morning I thanked her and called her thoughtful. Clara had shrugged and said, "You looked underfed." I had treated that like a joke. Looking back, it wasn't. There was the spring afternoon her back gate swelled shut after 3 days of rain. I came home to find her in the yard, one boot sunk in the mud, shoulder pressed against the wood with a look on her face that suggested she'd rather break her arm than ask for help. I dropped my tool bag, took one look at the hinge, and said, "Move." She gave me that cool, unimpressed stare of hers. I had it. You and I have very different definitions of that phrase. She snorted despite herself and stepped aside. 20 minutes later, the gate swung cleanly. Clara crossed her arms and looked at the repair like she was deciding whether to trust it. "Thank you," she said. "Try not to declare war on the fence without backup next time." That earned me one of her real smiles, the kind that always arrived a second late, like she had to remember how. Then there was the porch light. I'd noticed it before I let myself think about what it meant. If I texted that I was running late on a service call, the light was on before I turned into the street. If I got back after a long drive to Salem or Eugene, there it was waiting, warm against the dark. One night, I came in close to 1 in the morning and found Clara asleep in the armchair in the sitting room, a book face down on her chest and the porch light still burning through the lace curtain. I stood there longer than I should have, just looking at her, at the silver thread in her dark hair near one temple, at her bare feet tucked beneath a blanket, at the quiet trust of a woman sleeping in a house where she believed the last person through the door would make sure everything was locked. I turned off the light, draped the blanket back over her shoulder, and went upstairs without waking her. The next day she only said, "You were late," and I only answered, "The compressor was worse than we thought." We spoke as if the important part of that night had been mechanical failure. Around noon, my phone rang while I was replacing a cracked condenser fan behind a dentist's office. Logan's name lit up the screen. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered on the second ring. "Hey," I said. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, I just had a break between classes." His voice carried that careful tone 19-year-old boys used when they were pretending not to check on their fathers. "You sound tired. Long night. Work?" I hesitated. Not exactly. That got his attention. Logan had inherited his mother's silence and my habit of listening harder than I spoke. "So what is it exactly?" I crouched beside the unit and stared at the screws lined up on the concrete. Nothing. Just house stuff. He was quiet for a beat. "You say that like it means one thing, but it never means just one thing." I smiled despite myself. "When did you get so smug? When you started sounding happier talking about where you live than about anything else in your life?" The smile faded. "That's not true," I said, and even to me it sounded weak. "Dad." His voice softened. "I'm not trying to corner you. I'm just saying maybe if a place feels that much like home, it's not because of the wallpaper." After we hung up, I sat there a long time with the rag in my hand and the open unit humming softly beside me. Logan was wrong about the wallpaper. Clara hated wallpaper, said it trapped a room in someone else's past. But he wasn't wrong about the rest. By the time I drove back that evening, I knew I had been misnaming things for a long time. The food she left wasn't just food. The porch light wasn't just a safety habit. The repairs I made weren't just rent-paying gratitude. We had built a life in fragments and gestures, and I had kept translating it into smaller language because smaller language felt safer. Kindness, routine, convenience, anything but attachment. When I turned onto Hawthorne Lane and saw the porch before I even reached the curb, I felt the shift all over again. The light was already on. And for the first time, that didn't feel comforting. It felt like a question waiting for me to stop lying. The first text came at 9:14, while I was kneeling beside a rooftop unit behind a veterinary clinic with a socket wrench in one hand and my mind somewhere back on Clara's porch. "Morning. Hope today's easier on you than yesterday. If you're free later, I'd still love to see you again. Nina." I read it twice, then locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket like the screen had caught me doing something I didn't want witnessed. I had spent the morning making stupid mistakes. I dropped a screw into a drain pan and had to fish it out with 2 fingers. I misread a service note I'd written myself. At one point, I stood staring at a thermostat wire for a full 10 seconds before realizing I'd forgotten what I was reaching for. My apprentice for the day, a kid named Trevor from the supply company, gave me a sideways look. "You good?" "Fine," I said. He nodded in the slow, unconvinced way of someone too young to challenge a grown man, but smart enough not to believe him. You just called the capacitor a condenser. I let out a breath through my nose. Then it's a good thing you're here to protect the trade. That got a grin out of him. But it didn't fix the rest of the day. Every quiet moment turned into Clara's voice. Clara's face. Clara asking if Nina had made me laugh. Not because she wanted details, because she was trying to measure what place, if any, still belonged to her. At lunch, I sat in my truck with the windows cracked, a sandwich on the seat beside me, going untouched. I answered Nina before I could overthink it into another form of avoidance. I can meet for coffee after work. There's something I should be honest about, she replied almost immediately. Okay, 6 at Alder and Pine? I got there 10 minutes early and still felt late. The way you do when you've been arriving late to the truth for a long time. Alder and Pine sat on the corner across from the Riverwalk, all brass fixtures and fogged glass, the kind of place where people lingered without seeming to. Nina was already there when I walked in, seated by the window in a camel coat with her hands around a paper cup. She looked up, smiled, and then studied my face for half a second longer than politeness required. That bad? She asked as I sat down. I'm sorry? You have the expression of a man either about to confess to tax fraud or end something before it starts. Despite everything, I laughed. Nina smiled a little. Good. I was hoping you still knew how. I do. I wrapped both hands around my coffee, even though it was too hot. I'm just not sure I've been using that skill in the right places lately. She leaned back in her chair, patient, composed. Then tell me the truth. There wasn't any cruelty in her. That somehow made it harder. I had a good time with you, I said. I meant that. You're easy to talk to, and you're exactly the kind of person I should probably want to get to know better. That is the least flattering compliment I've had in a while. I know. I rubbed a hand over my jaw. I'm sorry. I'm doing a bad job of this. No, she said quietly. You're doing an honest one. Keep going. I looked down at the table. People moved outside the window in coats and scarves, blurred by the damp, early evening light. There's someone at home, I said. Nina didn't speak right away. She and I aren't together, I added. Nothing happened. At least not in the way that phrase usually means. But I think something has been happening for a long time, and I've been pretending I didn't see it because that was easier than admitting what it might cost. Nina folded one leg over the other. The woman you rent from. It wasn't a question. I looked up. How did you know that? She gave me a small, tired smile. Because on our date, you mentioned your house 3 times, and every time you did, your whole voice changed. Not the words. Your voice. She tilted her head. That only happens when a person is talking about someone who matters. I sat back like she'd touched a bruise I'd been ignoring. She asked me how the date went last night, I said before I meant to. And when I told her it went well, I stopped there because I didn't know how to explain a fading smile to someone who hadn't seen it. Nina saved me from trying. You didn't come here because you're confused about me, she said. You came because you're finally not confused about her. The truth of it landed with enough force to leave me still. I didn't mean to waste your time, I said. You didn't. She lifted her cup and looked past me toward the river. Most people waste your time by lying. You're at least trying not to. Then she looked back at me, sharper now. But if you know there's a woman at home who's already living in your head, don't make her compete with your denial. That's a cruel contest. I let out a slow breath. She probably wouldn't want to compete. No, Nina said. Women like that never do. They just stop standing where you can find them. That image hit me harder than it should have. Clara taking the porch light with her. Clara no longer leaving notes on the counter. Clara teaching herself to move through that house as if I were only a tenant again. I reached for my wallet. Nina stopped me with a look. You can buy the next woman coffee once you figure out how not to be afraid of her. I almost smiled. That might take a while. She stood and pulled on her gloves. Then don't take too long. By the time I walked back to my truck, the air had turned colder. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, hands resting on it, seeing Nina's face and Clara's overlaid in my mind, like two different versions of the same question. One woman had just told me the truth because she didn't owe me anything. The other had been telling me the truth for months without once saying it out loud. And if Nina could see where my heart kept going every time I looked away, then Clara had probably known for longer than I could bear to think about. That night, when I walked into the house, I noticed what was missing before I noticed anything else. The shelf beside the fireplace looked wrong. For a second, I couldn't place it. The lamp was where it always was. The stack of design books was still tucked beneath the lower table. The blue ceramic bowl Clara kept her keys in sat exactly in the center, like she'd measured it. But the brass carriage clock that had always stood on the top shelf was gone. I stopped in the middle of the living room and stared at the empty patch of wood where it had been. I remembered Clara winding that clock every Sunday evening with a tiny silver key. Once, months ago, I had asked if it still worked. She had said, "Only if you're patient with it," then added, almost to herself, "It belonged to my father." I shouldn't have known that shelf well enough to feel the absence in my chest. But I did. "Clara?" I called. No answer. Her coat was missing from the rack by the door, and the lights in the kitchen were off. I checked the time. Her shop should have been closed already, but something pulled at me anyway. 10 minutes later, I was parking in front of Whitmore and Pine, the antique store she'd spent the last 12 years trying to keep alive. The front display lights were still on. Through the window, I could see Clara behind the counter with her sleeves rolled up, wrapping a pair of old candlesticks in brown paper. She looked tired in the way people do when they've pushed past tired and reached the point where momentum is all that's left. Before I opened the door, I saw it. The brass carriage clock sat in the front display case under a small handwritten tag. Late 1800s. French. Excellent condition. The price below it made my stomach tighten. The bell over the door rang when I stepped inside. Clara looked up too fast, like she'd been bracing for someone else. When she saw me, her face changed into that composed expression she wore when she didn't want to be read. "You're out late," she said. "So are you. I own the place. I'm allowed." I walked to the display case without answering. I didn't touch the glass. I didn't need to. "You're selling your father's clock." Silence filled the space between us. Clara set the wrapped candlesticks down on the counter with careful hands. "It's just a clock, Ethan." "No," I said. "It isn't." That flicker went through her eyes again, the same one from the porch. Not anger, exposure. Before she could answer, the curtain behind the register parted, and Rosa Delgado stepped out carrying a ledger under one arm and her reading glasses in her hand. She took one look at the two of us and sighed like a woman who had been expecting this conversation for weeks. "Well," she said, "this seems overdue." "Rosa," Clara warned. "What?" Rosa set the ledger down. He has eyes. He was bound to notice half the house disappearing eventually. My attention snapped back to Clara. "Half the house?" "It isn't half the house," Clara said sharply. "No," Rosa replied. "Not yet." Clara closed her eyes for one brief second. I didn't ask you to stay late so you could narrate my private life. Rosa crossed her arms. And I didn't spend 20 years being your friend so I could watch you drown politely. I had never seen Clara look embarrassed before. Defensive, yes. Guarded, constantly. But embarrassment sat differently on her. It made her seem younger and more tired all at once. I lowered my voice. How bad is it? Clara looked at Rosa, then at me, then away again. It's manageable. Rosa made a small sound in the back of her throat. That means bad. Rosa. Oh, for heaven's sake, Clara, the county sent another notice this week. The roof over the back room still needs work. Your insurance went up. And instead of asking for help, you started pricing memories. The words hung in the warm, dust-scented air of the shop. I looked back at the clock in the case. Then at the empty spaces I suddenly remembered in the house. The missing silver frame from the hall table, the cut glass vase that hadn't been on the piano last week, the pair of brass sconces she had once said came from her grandmother's dining room. You've been selling things? I said quietly. Clara's mouth tightened. I've been handling it. Alone, yes. Her gaze met mine. Steady now because shame had shifted into pride. That is generally how handling things works. Rosa muttered something in Spanish under her breath and disappeared toward the back room, giving us privacy that felt more like a push than a kindness. I stepped closer to the counter. Was that what last night was really about? Clara's expression changed, just enough to tell me I had reached the part she didn't want touched. Last night, she said carefully, was about you having a nice evening with a woman who doesn't come with leaking gutters, tax notices, and 4 generations of bad financial decisions. That's not what I asked. No, she said, it's what I'm answering. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Somewhere in the back, a drawer slid shut. Outside, headlights passed across the front window and were gone. Then Clara exhaled and looked at the clock instead of me. When you said the date went well, she said softly, I realized how easy it would be for someone else to offer you a life that isn't always on the edge of needing something repaired. My throat tightened. And I hated, she continued, her voice thinning, that the first thing I felt wasn't happiness for you. It was relief that maybe if you chose a woman with a simpler life, I wouldn't have to find out what it would cost me if you stayed. That was it. Not just jealousy, fear, exhaustion, the quiet terror of wanting something she did not believe she could afford. I looked around the shop. The polished wood cases, the lamplight, the history with price tags hanging from it, and understood for the first time that Clara wasn't only trying to save a house. She was trying to keep the last proof that her life had held together before other people started leaving pieces of it behind. The next evening, I came home early and found a dark sedan in the driveway I didn't recognize. By the time I stepped onto the porch, voices were already carrying through the open front window. I'm done having the same conversation, a man said. Older voice, sharp edges. You can't keep pouring money into a house that gives nothing back. I stopped just inside the door. Clara stood in the living room with her arms folded so tightly across her chest it looked painful. Across from her was a gray-haired man in a wool coat, expensive watch, and the kind of posture people mistook for authority just because it took up space. He turned when he saw me. And you must be the tenant. Ethan, I said. This is my Uncle Harold, Clara said flatly. He was just leaving. I was not, Harold replied. Then to me, maybe you can talk some sense into her. The property taxes are rising, the repairs are endless, and sentimentality is not a business plan. Clara's face went still in that dangerous way people's faces did, right before they either broke or went cold. This is not your concern, she said to me. It became my concern when I walked into the middle of it. Harold gave a dry laugh. "You're renting a room, son, not inheriting the place." "Harold?" Clara snapped, but he kept going. "This house has been draining her for years. If she sold now, she could clear the debts, downsize, maybe even breathe for once. Instead, she keeps clinging to old wood and older memories." I looked at Clara. "Is he wrong about the taxes?" She looked away. "No." "The repairs?" "No." "Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because," she said, her voice suddenly thin with anger, "I am not required to turn every problem in my life into a committee discussion." Harold muttered. "At least someone around here still enjoys pretending pride pays invoices." Clara flinched. "Small, quick, but I saw it." "That's enough," I said. He studied me for a second, then reached for his gloves from the side table. "You'll learn," he said to Clara on his way out. "Houses like this don't break all at once. They take pieces from you until there's nothing left worth saving." The front door shut behind him, hard enough to rattle the glass. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Clara moved to the table and began stacking papers that were already stacked, straightening edges that didn't need straightening. It was the same motion she used when she was trying not to come apart. "I didn't need you defending me," she said. "Maybe not. But I'm still glad I did." She let out a humorless breath. "That's exactly the problem." I frowned. "What is?" Clara finally looked at me, and all the control she'd been gripping with both hands started to slip. "You make helping look easy. That's dangerous for someone like me." I didn't say anything. She pressed a hand to the table. "You fix things, Ethan. Doors, wiring, bad days, whatever is in front of you. And people start believing you might stay long enough for the repair to hold." The room went quiet around us. "My ex-fiancé used to make promises while standing in this exact room," she said. "Big ones, reassuring ones. Then he left me with bills, excuses, and a house that suddenly weighed twice as much because I was the only one underneath it." Her eyes were bright now, but steady. "So no, I'm not only afraid of losing the house." "What are you afraid of, then?" Her laugh was soft and awful, needing someone, trusting the relief, getting used to it, and then waking up one morning to find out I built my balance on a person who can walk away. The words landed clean and hard. I took a step closer. "I'm not him." "I know that," she said quickly. "That's what makes this worse." I stopped. "If you were careless," she said, "or selfish, or obviously wrong for me, this would be simple. But you're good to me in all the small ways that matter. You notice things. You stay calm when I panic. You carry groceries in without being asked and fix broken latches like the house matters to you." Her voice dropped. "You make me forget to protect myself. I had no shield for that kind of honesty." Clara looked down at the papers again. "And the night you came home from that date, all I could think was how easy your life could be if you chose someone who didn't come with debt, grief, and a front porch that needs replacing. Easy isn't the same as right." "No," she said, "but easy leaves less wreckage." That stayed with me. Because for the first time, I understood that if I kept standing in doorways, half in and half out of her life, I wouldn't be protecting Clara from pain. I'd be teaching her that leaving slowly still counted as leaving. When I pulled into the driveway the next night, the first thing I saw was a real estate sign lying face down in the back of Harold's sedan. My stomach dropped before I even shut off the truck. The porch light was on, but the front windows looked wrong somehow. Too bare, too careful. Inside, the living room had that staged feeling houses got when someone wanted strangers to imagine themselves living there. The framed photo that usually sat on the piano was gone. So was the crocheted throw Clara kept folded over the armchair. Even the air felt different, less like a home and more like a room preparing to be judged. Clara was at the dining table with a legal pad, a calculator, and 3 neat stacks of paperwork. She looked up when I came in, and I knew immediately she had made some kind of decision without me. "You're home early," she said. "What's the sign doing in Harold's car?" Her hand stopped on the calculator. He brought over some information. "What kind of information?" "The practical kind." I stared at the papers. "You're selling." She stood too quickly, as if sitting down had made her feel cornered. "I'm considering my options." "That's not the same thing as what this looks like." "No," she said, and her voice went strangely calm. "It's worse than what it looks like. Because this isn't just about the house anymore." I waited. Clara folded her arms. "You need to start thinking about where you'll go if I list it." It took me a second to process the sentence. "You're asking me to leave. I'm asking you not to get trapped in my mess. That's not what this is. It becomes that if I let it." She looked down at the papers, then back at me. "Ethan, you rent a room here. That was always the arrangement. Something in me went cold." "That's what you want this to be now?" "It's what it has to be." I laughed once, without humor. "Funny. Because a week ago, you were leaving me breakfast and remembering my job schedule better than I do." Color rose in her face, but she didn't look away. "And that was a mistake." "No," I said. "Pretending it meant nothing is the mistake." For the first time, her voice cracked. "You don't get to say that now, after all this time." The room went very still. I stepped closer. "Then tell me when I should have said it." "Good." "When you started noticing," she shot back. "When you realized I was making room for you in this house in ways that had nothing to do with rent. When you understood that every time I left the porch light on, I was doing more than waiting for you to lock up." I had no answer good enough for that. Clara pressed both palms to the back of a chair like she needed something solid. "I can survive losing this house if I have to. I can survive selling it, moving, starting smaller. I've survived worse." Her eyes met mine, bright and tired. "What I cannot survive is hanging my hope on someone who still isn't sure." I felt that all the way down. "I'm not asking you for promises," she said. "I'm asking you not to stand in front of me looking like home if you're still planning to keep one foot out the door." I looked around the room. The stripped surfaces, the paperwork, the careful emptiness creeping into every corner. She wasn't just preparing to sell. She was trying to make the loss happen fast, before hope could argue with it. "And if I don't want to leave?" I asked quietly. Her mouth trembled before she steadied it. "Then don't make it harder?" That was when I understood. Clara wasn't pushing me out because she wanted distance. She was doing it because if she let me stay one more night as a man who cared but hadn't chosen, she would start believing in something she couldn't control. I looked at the papers again, then at her. If I walked upstairs now and gave her space, I wouldn't be respecting her boundaries. I'd be helping her erase us before I had the courage to name what we were. I didn't go upstairs that night. Instead, I took my truck and drove until the neighborhood thinned out, and the streets gave way to warehouses, dark storefronts, and the all-night diner near the river where nobody noticed if a man sat too long with cold coffee. I took the corner booth by the window, pulled a pen from my jacket pocket, and spread out 3 napkins like they were blueprints. My phone rang before I could write the first word. It was Dean Foster, an old supervisor from a company I'd worked for years earlier in Spokane. We'd traded messages a week before about a service manager opening. Better salary, health benefits that didn't look like a joke. No old house, no Clara, no danger of wanting something complicated. "You still interested?" he asked after we exchanged the usual greetings. I need an answer by tomorrow morning. I looked out at the wet parking lot and thought about how easy it would be to call starting over a plan. No, I said. Dean paused. You sure? For the first time in a while, I said, Yeah, I am. When the call ended, I expected relief. What I felt instead was something steadier, like I'd finally stopped leaning my weight against the wrong door. A few minutes later, I called Logan. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice thick with sleep. Dad? Sorry. Did I wake you? Yes, he said. Which usually means this is either important or you forgot what time it is. It's important. That woke him up fast enough. Okay. What happened? I leaned back in the booth. I need you to tell me if I'm being stupid. That depends. Are we talking about tools, money, or feelings? I let out a short laugh. Feelings. Then the odds aren't great. Thanks. You called me. Fair. I rubbed my thumb over the edge of the napkin. There's a job in Spokane I could take. Cleaner situation, more money, easier life. I just turned it down. Logan was quiet for a beat. Because of her? Because of what happens if I keep pretending easy is the same thing as right. His exhale crackled softly through the phone. So this is real. Yes. Are you trying to save her? He asked. Or stay with her? The question went straight through me. Both, I admitted. But not the way you mean. I'm not trying to play hero, I know what this house means to her. And I know what she means to me. If I show up with nothing but feelings, she won't trust it. She shouldn't. No, Logan said. She shouldn't. I smiled, despite myself. You taking her side? I'm taking the side of any woman who's smart enough not to believe a man just because he finally got scared. That stung because it was right. So what do? I asked. Be clear, he said, and bring something better than panic. After we hung up, I got to work. Once I started, the plan came faster than I expected. The upstairs room I rented could be opened into the unused storage space beside it and turned into a proper short-term guest suite. The old insulation needed replacing anyway. Lower energy costs would help. The back room off Clara's shop could host restoration workshops twice a month, paid registration, limited seats. The side porch needed structural work, but if I rebuilt it and added safer lighting, the house value would rise. Between the guest suite, lower utility costs, and workshop income, the numbers stopped looking impossible. Not easy, not pretty, but not impossible. By the time the waitress topped off my coffee, I had 3 napkins covered in figures, repair phases, and a rough timeline. For the first time since Clara's smile faded on that porch, I wasn't just full of regret. I had something I could place in front of her that looked like staying. I folded the napkins carefully and slid them into my wallet. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. I stood beside my truck for a moment, looking at my reflection in the dark glass. Logan was right. Fear wasn't enough. Jealousy wasn't enough. Even love, by itself, might not be enough for a woman who had spent years learning that promises broke faster than old plaster. But maybe honesty with a backbone could be. I got into the truck and headed home, knowing 2 things for certain. I was done choosing the easier life. And before the night was over, I was done calling Clara Whitmore my landlady. When I came back, the house was dark except for the kitchen light. Clara was still there, sitting at the table in the same chair, but the papers were gone. In their place was a single mug of tea she hadn't touched. She looked up when I walked in, and whatever she saw in my face made her straighten. If you're here to argue again, she said, I don't think I can do that tonight. I'm not here to argue. I set my keys on the counter, pulled the folded napkins from my wallet, and laid them on the table between us. She looked down at them. What is this? A reason not to sell before you have to. Clara didn't sit back. Ethan, no, let me say this right for once. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I've been late to the truth in this house for a long time, and most of that is on me. She went still. I kept calling you my landlady because it made everything smaller, I said. Safer. It turned what I felt into a rental arrangement, and what you meant to me into something temporary. If I used the right label, I didn't have to ask myself why this house felt different the minute you were inside it. Clara's fingers tightened around the mug. I know you think I'm standing here because I got scared when I saw sale papers on the table, I went on. And maybe fear woke me up. But it didn't invent anything. It just forced me to stop lying about what's already been true. Her eyes lifted to mine. And what is that? That I stopped feeling like a tenant a long time ago. I took a breath. And I stopped thinking of you as my landlady even before that. I was just too much of a coward to admit it. The room stayed quiet. Then Clara said very softly, You don't get to say something that big unless you understand what it asks me to risk. I do understand. I touched the napkins. That's why I brought more than words. She looked down despite herself. I unfolded the first napkin. The upstairs room can be opened into the storage space beside it. With the insulation replaced and the bathroom fixtures updated, it could work as a short-term guest suite. The back room at the shop could host restoration workshops twice a month. Paid registration, limited seats. I can rebuild the side porch myself and replace the bad wiring in stages, which cuts labor cost and helps the house value. Clara stared at the figures. Then at me. You did all this tonight? Yes. Why? Because I love you, I thought. But what I said was somehow harder. Because staying with you shouldn't look like pity, and it shouldn't sound like rescue. I'm not here to take over your life, Clara. I'm here because this house matters to you, and you matter to me, and I want to build something with you instead of watching you lose it alone. Her expression cracked then. Not all the way, but enough. You make that sound simple, she whispered. It won't be simple. I shook my head. It'll be work. It'll be frustrating. We'll probably fight about paint colors and budgets and whether a 100-year-old porch deserves one more chance. A small breath of a smile touched her mouth and disappeared. But I'm not offering you easy. I'm offering you honest. Clara looked back at the numbers for a long time. And if this fails, then it fails with both of us carrying it, I said. Not just you. That hit her. I saw it. She put the mug down carefully. You don't know what it does to me to hear that. I know what it does to me not saying it. Her eyes filled then, bright in the kitchen light. I'm scared of believing you. I know. I'm scared you'll mean every word tonight and wake up next week regretting all of it. I might wake up scared, I said. But regret isn't the thing I'm worried about anymore. I took one step closer. The thing I'm worried about is letting you sell the one place that still feels like you before I tell you I want a life in it. Clara closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them again, something in her had softened. Not healed, not finished, but no longer braced for impact. I won't call Harold tomorrow, she said. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I'm not promising more than that, she added. I'm not asking for more than that tonight. She nodded once, then reached across the table and rested her hand over the napkins, over the numbers, over the place where my hand still lingered. For the first time, she didn't pull away. The weeks that followed didn't feel dramatic. They felt real. I spent the first Saturday opening the wall between my rented room and the narrow storage space beside it. Clara stood in the doorway with a pencil tucked behind one ear and a legal pad in her hand, watching me measure twice before I touched the saw. "You always frown like that before you cut into something," she said. "It's respect," I told her. "Old houses punish overconfidence." A small smile touched her mouth. "That may be the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." I looked up from the wall. "Good. I'd hate to peak too early." That earned me a quiet laugh, and the sound of it settled something deep in me. We did not rush into becoming a different kind of couple overnight. We didn't turn into people who draped themselves over each other in the kitchen or started talking like we had skipped all the difficult parts. What changed was steadier than that. Clara stopped hiding the mail when it came. I stopped acting like every repair I made needed some practical excuse behind it. She showed me the ledgers from the shop. I showed her where the worst heat loss was in the upstairs windows. We built trust the same way we built the plan, one honest line at a time. By the third week, the numbers looked less frightening. The guest suite upstairs had shape now. Patched walls, fresh primer, better lighting, a small reading chair Clara found at an estate sale, and refinished herself. The back room at the shop was nearly ready for the first restoration workshop. Rosa took over registrations with the kind of ruthless efficiency that made both of us grateful and slightly afraid of her. Even Harold, after 2 stiff conversations and a spreadsheet Clara mailed him herself, stopped calling every other day. One evening, I came home to find Clara kneeling on the porch floor with paint samples fanned around her like oversized playing cards. "You're judging colors without me?" I asked. She looked up. "You were late," I texted. "You texted 12 minutes ago." I set down my tool bag and crouched beside her. "And already you've become impossible. I've always been impossible. You've simply become less afraid of it." That was true enough to make me smile. She held up 2 sample cards. Warmer white or cleaner white. I studied them. "Those are the same color." "They are absolutely not." I pointed to the slightly cream one. "That one. The porch light will look better against it." Clara's eyes lifted to mine for a second. "You noticed that?" "I noticed a lot of things late," I said. "I'm trying to improve my timing." She looked down again, but I caught the softness in her face before she hid it. Later that night, after dinner, we sat on the porch steps with 2 mugs between us and the air cooling around the yard. The new side rail was in. The boards no longer dipped under our weight. From inside the house came the quiet hum of something no longer falling apart. Clara wrapped both hands around her tea. "I still can't believe I almost sold it." "The house?" She shook her head once. "No. The life inside it." I turned to look at her. She met my eyes, calm and open in a way that still felt a little miraculous. "I spent so long thinking survival meant holding everything alone," she said. "I never learned what it looked like to stay standing with someone. And now? Now I think it looks a lot like spreadsheets, insulation, and you arguing with me about porch paint." I laughed. "That's a very unflattering picture of love." "It's accurate." The porch light flicked on above us as the timer caught the dark. We both looked up. For 2 years, that light had meant she was awake. Then it meant she was waiting. Then it meant I had taken too long to understand what was being offered to me every time I came home after sunset. Now it meant something simpler and somehow bigger. It meant there was still a place for me here. Not in the upstairs room, not in the lease agreement, not in the careful little language I had used to make everything smaller. Here, beside her. Inside the life we were repairing by hand. I picked up my mug and leaned back against the step, listening to the evening settle around us. Clara's shoulder brushed mine, light and unafraid. And for the first time since I had moved into that house, home no longer felt like a place I was lucky enough to borrow. It felt like something we had chosen. I used to believe love announced itself with certainty. A clear moment, a clean decision, something loud enough that no decent man could miss it. But that wasn't how it came to me. It came in coffee left on the counter before dawn, in a porch light left burning after long days. In the way Clara learned the rhythm of my life before I had the courage to learn the shape of hers. What finally changed me wasn't jealousy or fear or even the thought of losing the house. It was understanding that real love, especially later in life, is not built on dramatic promises. It is built on patterns, on showing up, on honesty offered before comfort, on choosing not to let pride disguise itself as strength. Clara had spent years surviving by carrying everything alone. I had spent years hiding behind practical words, so I would never have to admit how deeply I needed a place and a person that felt like home. We were both wrong in ways that looked responsible from the outside. The truth is, some people do not enter your life like a storm. They become essential quietly. They hand you dinner when you forget to eat. They remember which jobs make your shoulders ache. They leave a light on, and one day you realize that what you've been calling routine has been love all along. A month after we finished the guest suite, Clara handed me a new key to the front door. Not because I was a tenant, not because I needed permission anymore, just because she smiled and said, "If this is your home too, you should stop using the old copy." I still keep that key in my pocket. If you've ever mistaken quiet care for ordinary kindness, maybe you know how long it can take to recognize home when it's already waiting for you.